a lot of med students don't get talked to about this is like how to really decide on what you want to do.
Hmm.
Um, I think the first major decision is
Welcome to Simulated Podcast. Too good to be true.
Officially live.
all right.
Ready?
Yep, let's do
All
it.
right. Welcome back to episode 4 of Simulated Podcast. We got Dr. Elliot Corey. He's actually an MD. So thank you so much for joining us today. Before we start, let me get a little background about who
Sure.
you are as a doctor. Let's get into that first.
Yeah, so I work in hospital medicine. I'm a hospitalist. Specialty is internal medicine.
Okay.
So I just recently became an attending physician. So my first full time,
Congrats.
adult doctor job. So
Yeah.
that's the general job description. You basically, as a hospitalist, function as sort of like primary care inside the hospital.
Okay.
Kind of back in the day, traditional physician jobs, you would be a primary care physician, and then when your patients got very sick and went into the hospital, you would admit them under your name and take care of them.
Okay.
Whereas nowadays, the hospital medicine specialty is we kind of take over that role as inpatient in
Oh,
hospitals.
okay.
We cover,
That's new information for me as well. Okay.
Yeah.
But let's rewind, turn back the clock a little bit. Just simple question. Dr. Elliot Corey, how does one become a doctor?
it's a long process, man.
Yeah,
it's a long
let's go
process.
high level.
It's I've been at it since graduating from high school. So you have to do usually an undergraduate degree. There's kind of two systems. I'm an international medical graduate, so I did my medical school outside of the United States, and there's
Okay.
kind of two very different systems. But generally, in the U.S., you would do an undergrad program, usually 4 years. Usually biology, but you can do any specialty you want as an undergraduate, any major you want. You would apply to medical school, fulfill the prerequisites, which are usually biology, physics, chemistry.
Mhm.
They have English requirements also. You would check whatever medical school you're applying to, make sure that you fulfilled the requirements. You do the MCAT, which is an exam that is very long and
Yeah.
very difficult. Apply to medical school. Usually 4-year programs in the U.S. And there's some programs outside of the U.S. that are structured a little differently, where you would do them right out of high school as a 6-year program.
Yeah, let's jump into the US part. So you recommended that you don't have to necessarily be a bio major, pre-med major, I'm guessing. So what are the type of majors
Yeah.
would you kind of be okay with applying into
They're
med school later on?
they're open to everything as long as you fulfill the prerequisites. So
Okay.
as long as you have your biology requirements, your physics and chemistry requirements, you have the English requirements, literally anything
Okay,
is
dope.
fine. And honestly, from what I've heard and seen, a lot of times they prefer kind of an unusual path
Yeah.
to medicine. So, most people do biology, but I've seen math majors, I've seen like music majors. It's
Music majors.
yeah,
What?
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So, in a lot of ways, it's beneficial. It's something that makes you stand out,
Yeah.
against, because it's such a competitive field. There's so many people applying that, anything that makes you seem kind of unique is gonna be very helpful to you.
Yeah, I gotta add some little flavor in there because I was actually about like applying out of high school as a bio major,
Yeah.
and I didn't understand what it meant to be an impacted major,
Yeah.
especially when I went to UC San Diego, UCLA. It is insanely competitive just
Yeah.
to get into a biology program because they have a set number of students that will come in, let them come into this university.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've seen psych majors go into, even just doctor or nurse, nursing school.
Yeah.
And musician is that's
Yeah.
crazy. Okay. So what about the MCAT? Okay, when would you recommend a student to start their MCAT studies?
Yeah, I mean, so I always recommend for people to take a course for the MCAT.
Okay.
It's incredibly hard to balance studying for that on top of the coursework that you're doing on a regular basis. So I took it. Let's see, this was a long time ago. I took it. I think in my junior year of college.
Okay. Like the
Um,
summer or just like
Yeah, I took a course over the summer to kind of prep me for it. It was Princeton Review, I believe, and it's a good class to take because you set a target score for yourself at the beginning of the class, and they kind of help you achieve whatever that target is.
okay.
Of course, the way they score the MCAT has changed actually a lot
Really?
since I've taken it. The test is very
So
different
what
now.
is it now?
So they've
from your
added some
understanding?
new topics to it. I think there's a lot more like psychology and like sociology sections to it as well, which weren't
Love
there
it.
when I took it. But when I took it, it was biological science, physical science, and
Mhm.
English were the kind of the three parts. But they've changed it some since then. But still, I recommend definitely take a class. It'll help prepare you, and then otherwise, unless you're a very organized person and structured and disciplined yourself, but a lot of people have difficulty, especially if you want to get it done on time.
Okay.
And that's one of the big, I think the big things in medicine. You have to keep pushing forward, and a lot of people get kind of stuck, and they feel like they're never ready to take the next exam or to move on to the next step. But you're never going to be ready. You have to kind of
Okay.
make the decision, jump in and do it. One way to do that is to sign up for a course that'll force you into it.
So you recommend going to Princeton Review?
Princeton Review or any of them. There's all sorts of different ones. I had my experience was with Princeton Review, which was quite good.
Okay. What?
Yeah.
Okay. What if I'm like just a very ambitious ambitious student who's trying to get into, let's say, Harvard? Just I don't know all the med schools, but like a top 0.1% med school. Like, what MCAT score should I get if I want to get into like Harvard or something med school?
Honestly, the scoring has changed now, so I'm not sure exactly.
Okay, I guess
like
back in
now.
your time.
Back in my time, it's the score was out of 15 for each section, and there were 3 sections, so out of 45, I scored I think a 33, which is kind of like 89, 90th percentile, which is really good.
Yeah, we could talk about
You
percentiles.
you
yeah,
want to
yeah.
get in that range or above if you're targeting those schools, and you want your GPA to be through the roof.
Okay. Like a
See,
4.0.
like a 4.0.
Did they? How far back did they look? Like, and what else did they look at? Like, did they look at high school? Did they look at college? And
College, yeah.
what about
I don't believe they.
dissertations, writings up? Yeah,
Yeah.
anything. Like, what do they look at?
The big thing is your GPA, and then there's a science GPA. So they look at kind of the GPA of just the
Okay.
science courses as well. That's an important thing. That's probably the number one thing is the GPA, and then 2 is the MCAT score. And then kind of everything else is kind of secondary to that. You have any research that you've done, any publications, and it's rare for someone that early to have full on publications, especially in the health field. But they look at that. They look at like community service and things like that. But
What would be your recommendation for students right now? Like, maybe they're studying for the MCAT today. And it's the summer, right? Summer's coming up.
yeah.
What would be your recommendation? Like, you mentioned Princeton Review, but what about the secondary stuff? Like, I'm guessing they look at it.
They do. I mean, honestly, any kind of research background, if you worked in a lab or you have a research project that's published, that's gonna help. But like I said, that's all secondary. But that's gonna help, and especially if you're targeting kind of those
Yeah.
big name programs, you're gonna want to stand out as much as possible.
What are
And,
like the big name programs in the U.S.?
for medical schools, the Ivy Leagues are all big
Mhm.
things. UCLA and USC over here, Stanford, WashU.
Shout out to Huberman. Shout out to Huberman.
Yeah, those are all great programs. Yeah.
And
there's-
then, okay, so now you're applying for medical school. I understand there's the MD side of it, but what about DO? Like,
yeah,
I'm sure that's a lot of people, at least in my circle, are like getting their DOs now. And
yeah.
how different is that really, getting an MD and a DO?
Yeah, it's fairly similar. There's a couple differences. So, DO programs are specific to the United States. They don't exist outside of the U.S.
Good to know.
And they were really created because there was a shortage of physicians in the U.S. It's very similar to MD, and the training is almost exactly the same, except they do a lot more of kind of like body manipulation and
Mhm.
joint stuff, and it's a little bit more kind of hands-on and kind of body manipulation. That's the one thing that's kind of added on, but for the most part, it's very similar. They do the same exact jobs as an MD physician.
Yeah. What specifics are you talking about body manipulation?
Like adjusting joints and
Okay.
things for pain and things like that. I don't I'm not a DO, so I don't know
Yeah.
exactly what they do, but that's kind of the differences from what I've been told.
Okay. And then, unfortunate case you don't get into a medical school in the US of your choice,
Mhm.
but then I understand there's options like the Caribbeans, and then you mentioned international programs.
Yeah, yeah.
I even looked at going to London and India to,
Oh yeah.
start my medical journey and just skip the
There's a
4-year
ton of
program,
options.
right? So what are the other
Yeah,
options?
there's a ton of options. So and actually there's a huge chunk of physicians in the U.S. that are international medical graduates, like a huge percentage.
Cool.
And
Like, what are we talking?
So, I mean,
Ballpark.
ballpark. I don't, I'd have to look this up.
Okay.
I honestly
I'll-
can't give you an
look it up.
exact number.
We can look it up.
We can have Jamie pull it up.
Yeah. Hey, Jamie, can you pull up the stat real quick?
But it's a huge percentage. And
Okay.
every year, when you're going through your interviews for residency, you'll run into people from every country in the world,
Okay.
um, that are applying for residencies here in the U.S. that were international students. But the Caribbean is very big. There's a lot of graduates from the Caribbean that come and do their residency here in the U.S. And then a lot of people, big chunk of physicians coming in from India.
Let's go.
Yeah, but all over the place, all over the place. Yeah, it's definitely a good option. It's a bit of a can be a little bit more challenging, kind of making your way back to the U.S.
How
because
so? How so would it be more
well,
challenging?
so my experience, so I did my medical school in Lebanon.
Yeah.
It's medicine is hard everywhere you do it. If you're doing it in other countries, my program was in English, but
Hmm.
when you start doing your clinical rotations where you work in hospitals, you have to kind of adjust to whatever the population speaks. So I
Yeah.
had to pick up a lot of medical terminology in Arabic,
Oof.
which is useful now because
Yeah.
occasionally you'll run into a situation where you need to use another language.
Yeah. With your patients,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it's occasionally useful, but that's a challenge definitely. Having to kind of adjust, and even I grew up speaking Arabic, but
Hmm.
medical terminology is very very
I can
different.
only imagine, right?
Yeah, and then you have to kind of create time for yourself to kind of do the exams for residency, so the USMLE exams.
Hmm.
Um, it can be difficult just because uh, the USMLEs are the one way for international students to stand out
Hmm.
because you're at a disadvantage. You're applying from another country. You want to stand out as much as possible, and the one way that international students usually do that is with the USMLE by scoring very high on the USMLE.
Okay.
So you have to make sure that you're putting a lot of time and effort into studying for that and prepping and getting a very good score so that you stand out and that increases your chances as much as possible to get a residency program.
But then you end up becoming a better doctor, I would imagine, right?
It
Yeah.
helps. It helps. A lot of the international
Yeah.
medical graduates I know are just some of the most intelligent people I've ever met.
Awesome.
And it helps putting all that effort in.
So the USMLE, the way I understand, there's 3 steps, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3.
Yeah,
Could you
and
kind of
and things are changing in the they've changed in the last few years as well.
okay?
So initially, so there was step one, which is kind of like a more of a basic sciences exam. You generally take that after your first 2 years of medical school, which are kind of like your kind of basic science years where you're in class. You're attending lectures and like you would in college.
Okay.
And step one is kind of a basic sciences exam. Step two is in two parts. There's a clinical knowledge and a clinical skills section. The clinical knowledge is kind of more clinical questions. So they give you like a patient, scenario. You have to make either a diagnosis or they ask you what's the next best step in the management of someone with this diagnosis.
Yeah.
Um, and then the clinical skills part would be kind of an exam that's done, over a day with like simulated patients,
Okay.
where you'd go into a room. They'd have a bunch of stations set up. Each room is a different patient with a different clinical presentation. You have to interview them, do a physical exam, go outside of the room and type up a note, and then put your kind of what you think is going on and what you would do to manage it. Um, that I believe they got rid of that over COVID because it was difficult to get people live in person to do
Yeah.
that. So that was one of the things that's changed recently, and I believe they also have changed step one and they made it more of a pass fail exam now instead of actually giving you a score on it.
Is that good or bad? That is pass fail, right?
It depends. As a med student in the US, that's probably good because it's
Hmm.
less stress on you. But like I mentioned before, as an international medical graduate, the best way you have of distinguishing yourself is by scoring very well on those exams, and especially step one. Step one is the biggest stressor for every medical student in the world.
Yeah.
um, and by and that's how you know you show that you're unique, and because you're at a disadvantage when you're applying. The one way to show how good you are is by scoring really well on this exam. And now that it's pass fail, they kind of take that away, and the only option you have is your step two score. That's the
Okay.
one thing that's still kind of graded.
What can you expect, I guess, now just done with step 1 and now you're doing clinical rotations, which goes into the step 2 sounds like, right?
Yeah,
What can
exactly.
you expect in clinical rotations as a,
Yeah, so
med school now?
you're gonna this is gonna be the best time to kind of figure out what you want to do long term. There's a lot of subspecialties in medicine. It's very kind of divided up. You have a lot of medical specialties, a lot of surgical specialties, some specialties that are in between and kind of incorporate the two.
Mhm.
So you get a lot of experience going, doing every, the kind of the major subspecialties. So, internal medicine and general surgery are like the big ones.
Yeah.
And you've got like, neurology, you do like ENT, OBGYN, psychiatry. You get experience in kind of all those fields. And that's the best time to really kind of decide what works for you. Um,
What would be your recommendation for someone who's going through the clinical rotations, getting exposure to everything A to Z?
yeah.
How do they know this is the one for me?
Yeah. That's a really great question. That's one of those things that actually a lot of med students don't get talked to about. This is like how to really decide on what you want to do.
Mhm.
I think the first major decision is whether or not you want to do a medical specialty or a surgical specialty, because the lifestyles are very different, and I think the people are very different that go into them.
Okay.
You have to have a certain personality type, I think, to be a surgeon, and you have to be willing to put up with a lot of.
Is
I don't want to. I don't want to say
This is
abuse,
explicit.
but I want to say,
Yeah, yeah.
you know,
You can say bullshit. It's fine.
yeah. As a medical student, as a resident, you put up with a lot of bullshit anyway. You have to deal with. I always tell people it's more of a marathon than anything else. You just have to endure so much, and then eventually you'll get to a point where you're successful and doing well. But the lead up to it is a long, arduous process.
So wrap it back. So how do you what do you mean by lifestyle of a doctor and
Yeah.
surgeon, or what was the other?
and medicine specialties.
Medicine
Medical
specialty.
specialties are kind of more your doing a lot more work with your mind as far as diagnosis and treatment and prescribing medications. Where surgery is a lot of hands-on work. Um, and they say a lot of the best surgeons are good medicine physicians as well too. They have a good knowledge base, and they're good at working with their hands. Um, so, like I said, the first big decision is kind of deciding which path you want to take from those two. And then kind of the next step is you kind of want to look at the day-to-day life of those doctors and what that's like, and if you can see yourself doing that. There's some specialties that are a little easier to as far as lifestyle, where, if you want to have a good family and home life,
Mhm.
you can. There's a lot of specialties where it requires a lot of sacrifice. Um, things like neurosurgery, where the training is 9 years or so. Things like that require a lot of sacrifice. You have to be willing to be on call a lot. Woken up in the middle of the night.
Oof.
You have to take a look at whether the specialty you want to do has emergency cases where you would be called and woken up in the middle of the night. Um, some people want nothing to do with that and just
Okay.
want to do a standard 9 to 5 job, and which is available to certain specialties like that. But
I go to like dermatology a little bit less in
Right.
traumatic incidences.
Exactly,
Right? Yeah.
exactly. Dermatology, ophthalmology, there's not a ton of emergencies. There's a few rare emergency cases, but there's not a ton of emergencies, and they often have, pretty comfortable, office jobs.
So run that back. Which medical specialties give you a bit more of a work-life balance, I guess?
I would say dermatology is a big one,
Yeah.
definitely. I would say ophthalmology.
What's ophthalmology,
For the eyes.
Okay.
Eye doctor. Um, those are the good ones. Psychiatry too. I think psychiatry is nice. And then maybe I don't know if you're planning on having a talk with our friend Prince, but
Yeah.
a lot of psychiatry now is especially since COVID, there's been a big move towards telemedicine, so where
Yeah.
things are kind of done virtually.
I
And
think he's doing that right now,
he is,
right?
yeah, he is, and it's not just psychiatry is one where that can work, because you're not really relying on doing a physical exam and having to look at physical exam findings, listening to someone's heart. A lot of it can be done through conversation. So
Is there any loss of patient care in the telehealth in that certain spaces?
it's hard to say. Sometimes that would be more of a question for Prince, I would think.
Yeah.
But occasionally you'll have patients that have psychosis, or they're not in a state where they can communicate very well. Often the kind of figuring out what's going on might be a little challenging just because of the lack of communication. But also, I think sometimes you need to be able to kind of read the room a little bit,
Yeah.
and it kind of gives you more of an idea of what's going on. A lot of doctors have kind of intuitive sense of
Yeah, those soft skills
what's
that come.
happening,
Yeah.
especially in psychiatry. You really can pick up on what's happening just by kind of reading the room and how people interact with each other and that kind
Interesting.
of thing. So I think that might be maybe a little bit limited, but for the most part, from what I've seen, people doing telemedicine can work pretty well.
Okay, what about the opposite? Which specialties in the medical field are you getting like crazy work hours, calls in the middle of the nights?
Yeah.
Like what are those?
So a lot of that would be surgical specialties.
Mhm. Is
You
that
know,
orthopedic?
orthopedic is under that umbrella too. So orthopedic, fractures. You're getting woken up for that as well. A lot of general surgery stuff. Sometimes there's emergency surgeries that need to happen.
Mhm.
Anything where you need an intervention.
Okay.
So cardiology, especially. You have people coming in the middle of the night with heart attacks
Oof.
that
Yeah.
need to be taken to the cath lab and have stents placed, immediately. It's a very time sensitive thing. So those would be the more high stress jobs. But also, jobs that tend to pay a lot are the ones where there's a lot of interventions where
Okay.
you're having to bill for doing procedures. So
So
things
it's a
like
balance game,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
absolutely.
So really, so as like a med student before you go into residency, you really got to gauge what you want, because you're doing this every single day,
Exactly.
right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, like I said, decide on medicine versus surgery, whichever one fits you the best, and then kind of look at the day to day life and think about, is this something that I can do, or I can see myself doing this for the rest of my life. Regardless of what it is, expect it to be challenging and difficult, and you having to put in a lot of hours, because there's no getting around that. Even with these jobs, the specialties that are a little bit lighter, a little better on work life balance, even then, during training you're put through a lot of long work hours, and
Mhm.
you have to deal with being fatigued and all that stuff.
And I'm sure it's super competitive. Like how competitive, let's say, is, I'm not calling it easier than, the work life, where the work life balance is better. How competitive are those residencies like dermatology, like
Right,
you mentioned? Yeah.
right. Dermatology and ophthalmology are also very high paying specialties. So
Mhm.
you're getting paid a lot, and you have a good kind of work life balance. So it's going to be insanely competitive.
Mhm.
And those are kind of the top. Usually you have to be ranked sort of at the top of your class to
Okay.
apply for these.
So it's super difficult.
Absolutely,
And I would
absolutely.
imagine also plastic surgery would be
Plastic surgery is
like
up
just
there too.
like
Yeah,
competitive, but also traumatic as well. Like you might have to deal with because
yeah,
of
yeah. Absolutely,
facial surgeries or
absolutely.
something.
That's another thing is I know a lot of people that are hypochondriacs, and you can't be that if you're a physician. There's a thing called med student syndrome,
Okay.
where everything you start to learn about in medical school, you start to see those symptoms in yourself,
Oh god.
and you can't. I know some people like that, and I would never recommend that they go into medicine.
Oh my god, you're just like, oh my god, I gotta fix myself now.
Exactly. Exactly. Even little things, you
Uh,
start learning about your urinary symptoms, and you're like, I can't even go to the bathroom without thinking that I'm gonna die.
oh my god. Okay, so don't be a hypochondriac and be a doctor. Okay, so what can I expect now? I chose my field of residency. What can I expect as a resident?
Yeah. So, I can speak from an internal medicine standpoint.
Yeah.
So, internal medicine residency is 3 years.
Okay.
Um, it's a very broad field. So, and it allows you to kind of, if you want to go into a fellowship afterwards, you can do a lot of kind of subspecialties, and we can talk about those. But as a resident, most programs in the U.S. especially are very like what's called front loaded, where your first year as an intern is going to be your heaviest year. They're just going to slam you with work,
Okay.
and you're going to be miserable for the whole year. But as you move on to the second and third year, your life gets a little bit easier as you go. My program was a little different,
Hmm.
where we had kind of less hours as an intern, and kind of added on responsibilities as you moved on in the program. But most programs are very, very heavy first year. So go in there expecting that. Some places will kind of throw you into the deep end and be like, just put you in a
It's like a
situation
little
where,
hazing little thing, I'm
yeah,
guessing.
yeah. Some programs will do that. I never felt like that at my program.
That's good.
Um, I went to St. Luke's Hospital in St. Louis, Missouri, in West County.
Ooh.
Shout out to to St. Luke's.
Yeah.
But definitely expect to work very hard. Expect to work long hours and to not get paid adequately for the hours that you're putting in.
Yeah, so let's deep dive into the residency. So like it's right now it's May 31st, in June, a lot of residents are now
Mhm.
starting, they're probably having a good time right now on vacations and
Oh yeah,
whatnot,
yeah.
but also scrambling, I'm sure, to find an apartment or, living
Right.
situation because they're going left, right, up, God
Yeah,
knows
yeah.
where. But now as a resident, you say you got to work crazy long hours. Like how many hours are we talking on average,
So
or range wise?
nowadays, the ACGME has like requirements for, they put limits on how long people can work for. Um,
What's
so
ACG?
that's a group that kind of governs the rules
Okay.
for residency. So they put limits. So that back in the day, they could make you basically live in the hospital,
Oh gosh.
and there was nothing you could do about it. But now there's limits because they've noticed that there's a lot of problems. If you go about things like that, there's people go through depression.
Mm-hmm.
There's I'm sure you've seen in the news. There's certain residencies where people have committed suicide and
Mm-hmm.
that sort of thing. So they really want to make sure that it's a safe environment. You can't be working 36 hours straight and then go to drive home and you're falling asleep at the wheel and things like that. They just want to avoid those types of situations. But um, most programs will have like a day team and a night team. So
Mm-hmm.
you'll work on your call days. You'll work do admissions during the day, and then another team comes over overnight and takes over at 7 p.m. and works from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. A lot of programs are doing that now. My program was still kind of on an older system where we would do overnight shifts. So as on call day, you would work um, 24 hours, and then you'd have kind of 4 hours to kind of finish your work after that and go home. So up to like 28 hours in the hospital out at one time. But if you do that, you're required to have a certain number of hours off after that.
Okay.
Um, you're not allowed to do more than a certain number of days in a row um, without having a day off. You're required to have a certain number of days off over a month. So it's very, you know, regulated now.
That's good.
Yeah,
I'm happy to hear that.
I think it's for the best. A lot of older docs will they kind of look down on it in a way. They're like, "Oh, you don't
They're
know,
like, back in my day.
yeah, you guys are weak nowadays. You don't know what we had to go through." But really, it's a lot better
Okay.
because you can't be torturing people.
Yeah, yeah. And
You
I'm
know,
sure like, their mind gets all foggy and it's not,
yeah, you want to be
your
sharp.
cognitive functions are not, at its max capacity.
Exactly,
Right?
exactly. And you're doing a job where, people's lives kind of depend on the decisions that you're making, and you want to be as sharp as possible.
Yeah. So, we're talking about like, the med life is a marathon, but now you're like in the middle of the marathon as a resident, close to being to the end.
Yeah.
Any other additional tips, like sleep schedule, workout schedule, social
Yeah,
schedules?
it helps to have something to take your mind off of it. I think, having a workout routine is very, very helpful. Um, COVID was a big problem for a lot of people. The gyms closed down,
Mm-hmm.
people were isolated, you want to have people to talk to as well,
Yeah.
it helps to kind of form groups or connections. You'll make friends during your residency. So a lot of people like to study in groups, study together, kind of push people to keep working. um that's always really useful. I think another thing for residents coming in, you're going to see a lot of like good practice, and you're going to see a lot of very poor practice from different physicians,
Mm-hmm.
and you want to be able to take as much of the good as you can and kind of leave the bad stuff where it is. You want to kind of collect, use other people as an example and take all the the good things that they do and kind of try to avoid the negatives.
Yeah, yeah. I like
That's
that.
definitely a big piece of advice for people.
I think that's true for anything in life, right? With your
Absolutely.
parents and stuff, you take the best of, what they can give
Absolutely.
you. And I'm
Absolutely.
sure like physicians almost like, your mentor at that point,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. The other thing I would really recommend is you know, things that are not med school knowledge, things like bedside manner.
Mm-hmm.
Those are things that you have to pick up on and are very, very useful skills to have. I can't tell you how big of a difference it makes just,
To the patient.
to the patient, just
Yeah.
being able, to give them the sense that you're listening to them. Because, for you, you're seeing a ton of patients, you're jumping from room to room to room. To you, you're spending 6 minutes, but for them, they've been waiting hours
Mm-hmm.
for you to come in and see them, so um just, give them the impression that you're it's their time and you're listening to them, and, let them talk. Sometimes we're in a rush and we want to get things done as quickly as possible, but, give them some time to feel like they're, they've said what they need to say. um Definitely is very, very important. And then, yeah, I think that's probably my biggest piece of advice to residents, because that's not something that you're going to learn from other physicians. It's kind of how you approach dialogue, and how,
Yeah.
how comfortable you make the patient feel.
And then who's observing all the residents, like live? Like, is it the
Oh yeah.
physician? Like,
So, as a resident, you are an employee of the hospital. So you have an MD. You're a functioning doctor, but you're still in training. So, a lot of times, sometimes, usually there's teams in residency. So usually, you have an intern and a senior resident that are kind of grouped together, or a senior resident and two interns. Um, Sometimes the senior resident, especially early on in the rotation, will, go into the room with you and kind of observe and give you
mhm,
tips
mhm.
and things like that. A lot of times, you can round on your own. You see the patients by
Oh,
yourself,
wow.
but there's always an attending physician,
Yeah.
who is responsible for those same patients. You would go and kind of present the case to the attending physician and tell them kind of what you think, what, you know, decisions you want to make, what treatment you want to do. And they'll kind of look over the case with you and kind of point you in the right direction, give you tips, tell you what you did right, what you did wrong. I believe they're also required to physically go in and see the patient themselves too.
Okay.
So,
So, like, I can imagine that's pretty nervous, seeing maybe your first patient, first 10, 100 patients. Like,
yeah, yeah.
were you like that? Did you see other residents like that? How'd you get over that
Yeah,
hump,
especially because, my program is very heavy on international medical graduates. So you have people who, maybe their English isn't so great, and they're
Hmm.
they're coming in and seeing American patients for the first time. Um, there's definitely a lot of nerves, a lot of,
I can imagine.
one other thing that I think, imposter syndrome is a very big thing in medicine, and just know that everyone has it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You sometimes get the impression that you're lagging behind other people, that you see the way other people are working, and you're like, you feel inferior in a way. Not Don't ever think like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Um
Yeah, imposter syndrome. Just for audience to know, I said this actually on the first episode.
yeah.
Um, it's pretty popular in the millennials and Gen Z generation, right? So like, where it's like you believe that your capabilities, I'd say, at this level, but then if you don't do the action or the deed that you need to do, but once you do it, you realize you're really good at what you can do,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You just gotta take the leap of faith and jump over the
Yeah.
the
Yeah, yeah.
cliff onto the next side, and you'll get it done.
Yeah, no, people.
It's like Nike, just do it. Sponsor me, Nike.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
a lot of people feel like they're not worthy of where they are. Where
yeah,
you
and
always
that's
got to
part of it
remember,
too.
you're still in training, you're still learning. It's Medicine is a lifelong learning process.
Mhm.
Even as an attending physician, you're not going to know nearly everything. You won't even be close to knowing everything. You're going to be relying on other people. You're going to constantly be studying, constantly reading. Yeah, and everyone feels that way.
So you still got to study as a resident, like that.
Oh yeah,
Oh
yeah.
gosh.
So you have to, at the end of your residency, you have to pass boards. So the board exam is how you get
Ah,
licensed to practice. Um, so you have to pass that, and kind of every year in residency they do, kind of a practice exam every year,
that's good.
to kind of gauge where you are, to make sure you're on track to kind of passing the boards.
Okay, so
Um,
how do you stand out as a resident? One, you said bedside manners. It seems like there's an exam, but like, how
yeah,
else can you stand out as like a resident? Because I imagine residents, there's about like 8, 10 residents all at the same time, right?
yeah. So the nice thing about residency is, so a lot of you are kind of in the same boat. You're not really
Hmm.
competing with each other that much for
Okay,
anything.
that's good.
The one thing that you might be competing for is, for a fellowship, so kind of a subspecialty later on. And it sort of becomes more kind of individual effort. Things that would help you stand out, if you're applying for a fellowship, is definitely research. That's a big thing. And again, it's hard to find the time to do that.
Yeah.
You're working, you're not allowed to work more than 80-hour average
Okay.
a week. But you're still working, usually at least 60 hours a week,
That's a
and
lot.
it's a lot. It's draining. And to, on top of that, to have to find, a research project and do data analysis and all this stuff on the side and, write up a paper and publish it and send it into a journal is it's hard to find the time to do that, but you have to do it. That's especially if you want a competitive fellowship. So in internal medicine, things like gastroenterology, cardiology are very, very competitive, and the only way to really stand out is for you to do uh, to publish something, to have your
Hmm.
name out there in the medical literature. Um, yeah, there was also step three, which we didn't talk
Yeah,
about,
let's talk about step three. Sure,
yeah.
let's
So
do it.
step three is a requirement for graduating residency as well. It's actually very similar to step two. It's a 2 day exam actually. So
Okay.
it's very similar. They're all multiple choice questions or clinical scenarios. But you also have this kind of second part of the exam where it's kind of like a live patient simulation. So you have a kind of computer program that you're working on. They present you with this patient, and then you order labs and stuff, and you can move the clock forward and get lab results back. You see if the patient's
Yeah, that's
improving
cool.
or getting worse. So there's cases you have to do that on step three as well. But it's a requirement to graduate residency, and it's a big deal for a lot of residency programs because a lot of people kind of procrastinate on it, and
Yeah, yeah.
a lot of people get to their last year and they still haven't done it. So it's for people who are trying to really stand out, who are trying to get into residency, a big thing you can do is to finish step three early. Because program directors will see
Oh,
that. Oh, it's a big deal to them that you finished it, because a
yeah,
lot of
yeah.
times they have to, hunt people down and chase after them and be like, hey, where are you at with step three? So
So how many hours would you recommend studying for step one, step two, and step three? On a good
it depends.
months out. I'm talking about like
Yeah,
months. I'm sure it takes
it
months.
really depends. Like I said, as an international graduate, because you're when for step one now, it's pass fail now,
Hmm.
but when I was taking it, your grade kind of really was one of the big determining factors of whether or not you would get into a residency in the US.
Hmm.
So a lot of people spent months and months studying for it. Even people started studying for it a year in advance. You're supposed to
Wow.
take it, but before after your second year of med school. But as an international, you don't have a lot of time to do that, so a
Hmm.
lot of people will kind of finish med school, take some time off, study and do the exam kind of after they're done
Okay.
with medical school. But
What about step two and step three? How long would you recommend studying and putting? How many hours, months?
step three, I think you can, you're required. It was a requirement at my program to do it in your first year of residency. So you just got to look at where your schedule is, find out where you have kind of lighter rotations. The one thing I would tell people is don't use your vacation time for step three. Don't. You want to study during your light rotations and sign up for it kind of at the end of a block of really light, like kind of light rotations. You know, I would say maybe like 2 months. If you have like 2 months of kind of light rotations, study during those 2 months and then take it at the end.
Okay.
As far as step one, now that it's pass fail, it's less of a stressor, but we would study months in advance. And that was the other thing that, people were always afraid to just go in and take the exam, because you never feel ready for it. You're never going to feel ready for it. You just have to kind of bite the bullet and be like,
Yeah.
I can't do more than I'm doing right now. It's best to study in a condensed block of time. The more you kind of postpone and kind of drag things out, you're going to forget things. There's huge chunks of information that you need to memorize.
Okay.
So kind of try to condense it into a kind of a short period of time, blast through it, memorize as much as you can, go in and take the test. And then, yeah, that's really the only way.
So now you're done with step three. You're done with your residency program.
Hmm.
So now, what are your options? I'm sure
Yeah.
hospitals is
So,
one of them, like you are.
in internal medicine, most people will work either as a hospitalist or they'll work as a primary care physician. So those are
Okay.
kind of the two kind of branches in internal medicine. Or the other option you have is to go into a fellowship. So fellowships are anywhere from an additional, 2 to 3 years. Internal medicine is pretty broad. So you
Hmm.
have, gastroenterology, cardiology, infectious disease, nephrology, hematology and oncology. So a lot of options really. Pulmonary and critical care. Those are all within internal medicine. It really depends. Internal medicine, there's a really big demand now,
Good to
especially for
know.
hospitalists. Um, it's a job that is when you're working, the hours are heavy, but you have a lot of kind of time off. So most people who work as hospitalists will work 7 days on and 7 days off.
Okay.
Um, it's a very nice schedule if you want to, raise a family,
Hmm.
have kids. You have time to
To be
time for
part of
that.
their life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And it's a very in demand specialty. So there's a lot of people that push to do fellowships and subspecialties and things like that. There's kind of maybe a bit of a prestige factor
Yeah. Yeah.
to it, but hospitalist jobs pay really well. You have a lot of days off to spend with your family. It's a very I think a very good specialty, and I think
Sounds
a lot of
rewarding.
people
Yeah. Yeah.
should consider it.
What's okay? So let's deep dive into now a hospitalist. Like, what's the day in the life of a hospitalist? You know.
Yeah, so I work as a nocturnist currently, so I do just night shifts in the hospital. So I am in charge of admissions basically. So um, people that are sick come to the ER. They're seen by an ER doctor. If they can be sent home, they'll be sent home. If they have something that needs kind of more long-term treatment, they need to be admitted upstairs to the hospital. They'll give me a call. I'll come downstairs, discuss with the ER doctor, go see the patient in the
Mm.
ER, and then I'm in charge of admitting them up to the hospital, take care of them overnight. During the day, they usually get reassigned to a daytime
Hmm.
hospitalist. Um, as a hospitalist during the day, you're rounding on those patients on a daily basis. You're, you know, changing treatment. You're figuring out how you're going to get this person home. Do they need to go to a rehab facility? Do they need something else? Do they need to be seen by a specialist? If someone has a GI bleed in their stomach, they need procedure done. They need a GI doctor to come see them. You talk to a GI doctor, have them come by. So those are the things you're doing as an internal medicine doctor. And yeah, uh, that's it. The work hours are long,
Hmm.
but like I said, usually working 7 days on, 7 days off, so that really makes up for it.
So if let's say I'm done with my residency, I'm trying to look for a hospitalist job.
Hmm.
What's your advice there? You know, guidance there.
Yeah, like I said, it's very high demand, and it really depends on where you want to go. So I mean, in LA, it can be a little competitive sometimes to find
Sure.
a job, but there are a lot of other states and cities where they're really in high demand and they're actively looking for people. So you'll see it when you're a resident, when you're kind of getting close to to graduating, you'll start getting tons of emails about positions that are opening up. They'll send you emails with like the pay, how much you get paid for working in particular areas. There's a lot of underserved areas where they'll pay you a ton of money to go there.
So
So
they're really trying to recruit you.
oh yeah, yeah. It really depends on how flexible you are. A lot of people, there's a lot of residents that are married and have kids, so it becomes a little more challenging to kind of move your family around every
Yeah,
so
yeah,
often. So a lot of people kind of just want to settle down in one area. And
yeah. I would imagine as a fellowship, you know, you have limited options of where you can do those fellowships.
it
Don't you have to still
depends.
move your families and
Yeah, yeah. A lot of times you have a say in where you apply, but a lot of times, to if you really want to do a particular fellowship, you want to apply across the board and like all over the country, and wherever you get in, it's the same as I don't know. If, we haven't really talked about the match process, but that's kind of how people get matched for residencies, the same way they get matched for fellowships. So, you apply to a bunch of programs, they send invites for interviews if they like you.
hmm.
And then after the interviews, you rank all the programs that you interviewed at from one to however many. And then the programs will rank all the candidates from one to however many. It all gets thrown into a computer program and they spit out either, one place for each person or no place if you don't match.
Okay. Let's talk about that. The
Yeah,
matching of residency first, and then talk
it's a
about
big
the
deal.
matching and fellowship.
It's a big deal. It's all very
And the
similar.
interview is that the interview process
Yeah,
or
so this
application?
the match process is after the interview.
Okay.
So, like I said, you send an application in wherever, if you want to apply for particular fellowships, you choose which places you're applying to. If they like you, they'll send you an invite to go interview with them. Um, the interview process is getting the interview invite is a big step. A lot of the interview process, and I'd say especially more for like residencies, a lot of the interview process is just to make sure that you're not a crazy person. That they want to make sure that they can work with you, and you're not going to
Okay.
be difficult to work with. You're not going to be you have good social, decent social skills. You can communicate. You're not, going to be a hazard to patients. You're going to be open to learning. They want to teach you to practice, the proper way. Um, so a lot of the interview process is that, and that's usually the advice I give people is like, don't focus too much on trying to have the perfect answer and like rehearsing. Yeah, you can rehearse, but you want to sound natural. You want to be yourself and just come
Yeah.
off as just the normal normal person that people would like to work with. Um, After the interviews, that's when you rank the programs, and that's when the kind of the computer program fits in.
Yeah. It's true in the corporate realm too. Every job I apply to, in the interview process, they really try to see if you're easy to work with,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah,
that's all. They don't want to butt heads. They don't want, like, this type of individual
yeah.
where it'd be difficult to work with,
Yeah,
right?
and that's
So,
actually in the residency interview process. One of the red flags from programs is if they start asking you about like technical questions. If they start asking you, "Oh, if you get a patient that has this, what would you do? How would you treat this?" That's that's usually a red flag for the program because they know everyone who's applying is an intelligent person. I mean, you've been through
mhm,
med school, you know how to study, you know how to learn. And they're expecting to teach you the way they want you to practice. That's why the focus is more on the social skills and kind of
mhm.
how you would fit into their team. And yeah, like you said, that's um, pretty similar to I think how interviews work in other places as
Yeah,
well. It's all about kind of finding the right fit.
yeah. I could only imagine the interview process being kind of difficult and almost as an interviewer. My question would be like, why medicine? Why did you choose to go to med school? Like, my cookie cut, I'm sure I have a cookie cut answer. It's like, I love medicine. I want to be a doctor,
Right, right.
like, or I had like some traumatic, family issues, someone passed with so and so, or someone is dealing with this disease at home. Like, I feel like that's everyone's answer, right?
Yeah,
So, beyond like being the social skills, like, be a
yeah,
little bit more specific. What would you say in the interview process if I asked you,
yeah.
why do you want to be a doctor?
That's the first question that they'll ask you in every interview.
No kidding.
It's also, when you're doing your applications, you have to write a personal statement, and that's the subject of the personal statement. So it's really something that you have to dig into. I don't know if I've even found a good answer for this. It's, what I can say is that programs don't like to hear the kind of cliche answers.
Hmm.
The I like to help people. The everyone has an experience with a family member that's been sick, and that might be a driving force. It definitely would be, but I would definitely try to add on to that, not just rely on that
Hmm.
to be your answer. Um, you know, you really have to find a personal connection to it and try to personalize it to yourself as much as possible. Um, when I was applying, I had a situation happen to me, and when I was a medical student, where I was a patient for, I had a food impaction where a piece of steak got stuck in my esophagus. I had to get a procedure to get it taken out.
Did not know.
So
Oh
you
gosh.
got to, I got to experience life as from the patient side of things, and it helps you kind of more empathize with how your patients are feeling, and
Yeah.
you know the wait time. You understand, like, oh, they've been, this person's been waiting for me for several hours. It kind of affects how you deal with people. And I think that's a good way to approach that question, is kind of put your own personal experience into it and try to make it as unique to you as possible.
So you didn't put yourself in the patient's shoes almost,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Interesting. Okay.
yeah.
Huh. I guess any other advices you would give, like you gave advice, on residency program, be an empathetic person, bedside manners is
Hmm.
very important. But any person who's trying to be a future resident or future doctor, any general advice?
Yeah, the biggest thing, like I mentioned before, is that it's a marathon.
Yeah.
It is one big grind, and the most important thing is that don't get discouraged, and don't you're gonna feel like quitting. Everyone does, but you're gonna have to be able to put up with a lot of crap for a long period of time, and eventually it's worth it. Just don't feel discouraged. And there's a culture in medicine also where they like to they pimp you out on questions. They ask you, they put you on the spot. They kind of
Yeah.
grill you of your knowledge of things, and it's easy to feel discouraged and to feel down from that. But that's the culture of how it is, in medicine. And don't feel discouraged. Keep pushing forward. I think that's really the best piece of
Yeah.
advice.
And I'm
It's
sure these questions are to see your problem solving kind of mechanisms, right, in your brain, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They are, and it's a way to make sure that you're keeping up with studying and that your knowledge base is there. You know,
Okay.
there's no better way to encourage someone to study than to, embarrass you in public.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
I know that's some really good advice, but thanks for the advice. Again, just number one biggest piece of advice, for being a resident bedside manners, but overall medical school system, from going into it sounds like even undergrad to med school to resident, it's a marathon, right?
it's a long, long process.
Okay.
Um, and it's very daunting if you're a college student right now and you're looking at all the stuff that you have to do moving forward. It's so easy to get overwhelmed and
Yeah.
discouraged. One step at a time. Just don't look too far ahead. Look at what the next thing that you have to do is, and eventually, before you know it, you'll be at the end of the road.
Yeah, yeah. But that kind of leads into one of my hot takes.
Yeah.
You ready for the hot takes?
Go for it.
Okay. I forget who told me this, and I don't even know if it's true. You can fact check me. But the USMLE system or just the med school system was designed by someone who used to take a lot of cocaine when it was legal back in like whatever the 20s or whatever it was. Because it was in this can of Coke, sponsor me Coca-Cola.
I don't.
Because it's a marathon, right?
I actually had never heard that, but it wouldn't surprise me based on what I've seen. There's a lot of craziness.
Because you're just
involved.
like energize your body.
Yeah. I mean, you have to be on and functional, and your brain has to be working at all hours of the day. Even as an attending, even not, certain attendings, you'll get called in the middle of the night, and you'll have to make a decision about a patient.
So you can't be drinking and having.
Well, there's
You know.
on-call schedules.
Okay.
So that's another thing is when you're applying is you look at your on-call schedules. You'll know the days where you need to be
Okay.
you need to be sober.
You need to be
know?
social a little bit. I guess, okay, when you're off call, hot take number 2,
Yeah.
does it bother you if, I don't know, if people ask you for medical advice outside of
That's
work?
expected, man. That's expected. Like,
Yeah.
if you're going into medicine, expect that to be a normal part of your life.
Okay,
Your
okay.
friends and family all the time will call you for advice and will call you for a consultation over the phone.
And that's just how life
There's
is.
that's just how it is. There's no avoiding it. I
Okay.
mean, you can draw the line with some people and be like, hey, like I'm not gonna do this. Go see your doctor.
Yeah.
But often it's simple questions you can answer. Give a little bit of advice. No doctor knows everything either. You can always
Yeah.
it that's another good piece of advice for residents is like don't ever be afraid to say I don't know.
Yeah.
The worst thing you can do is pretend like you know something and make a bad decision.
Gotcha.
So, worst thing you can do, you can tell people you don't know the answer and have them see a specialist. But
Okay, hot take number 3. What about the pay range when you're a resident versus when, some
Yeah.
nurses get paid, crazy amount of money, like, $200,000 being a travel nurse, especially. Like, how does that kind of impact the workspace?
yeah, definitely travel nursing is a very lucrative,
Yeah.
lucrative field to be in. As a resident, you're not getting paid it's
It's like
very
what,
minimal.
60, it's like 60 grand or so, right?
Yeah, it
Last I
depends on
checked.
where you are. Anywhere between like 45 to 75 maybe,
Mhm.
depending on what city you're in. I think when I was applying, I think Staten Island was like the highest paying.
Okay.
That was starting around like 70, 72, something like that. But again, you're working, at least 60 hours a week, as hourly, it's negligible. You're not
Yeah,
making
yeah, yeah.
anything. It's all temporary. So one thing to keep in mind, you'll make money eventually. And that's another thing that like people, it's not an interview answer, to say that you're in the medicine to make money because that's a bad answer. There's a lot of easier ways to make money in the world than to be a doctor and go through all this,
Right.
fatigue and for
Like
for
you're
years.
you're in it for being a doctor, right?
Yeah. There's easier ways to make money, but you're eventually going to make money. I think average salary for physician is like 265,000 a year is about average. So you're gonna make money eventually, and that's one thing that it's really probably important for a lot of people to plan for is kind of financially how you're gonna approach things because it's a different world, especially in California, working here. So a lot of the physician jobs are 1099 jobs. You're contracted.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of jobs will require you to have, like an LLC or an S corp to your name, and then they pay you through the company. So, um, always a good idea to have a financial advisor, someone to go to help kind of manage this, because it's a very complicated process. And honestly, for me personally, I put all my brain power into what I do for a living, and I don't want to think about anything
Makes sense. Makes sense.
outside of medicine. So, get as much help as you can get.
Yeah, I see a lot, I hear a lot at least where like, a lot of doctors have the LLC, one for the liability aspect, but
hmm
two to, manage their finances in the best possible way,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, get financial advice. That's
Yeah, yeah.
another big piece of advice.
Any last comments?
Um, you know, I think we've covered most of it. Really, the big thing I want to emphasize is just keep going. One big grind, keep going forward. Pick up as much, positives as you can from your mentors and from the people around you. And it's a one big kind of learning process.
Yeah.
The entire thing, your entire career is going to be centered around learning and kind of improving. And even if you're a certified physician, you have to recertify every 10 years. So you're constantly having to pick up on new information,
Hmm.
and just for the sake of your patients, you want to make sure that your patients are all getting, the most up to date kind of medical treatment. So
Yeah.
um, keep learning, keep grinding, and that's just that's the life.
And then I'll add to that, like, don't be discouraged from like leaving, or even just like changing majors when you can as an
Oh yeah.
undergrad. So I effectively did that. I got my biology degree, but I got my MBA right afterwards,
hmm
right? And I'm happy where I'm at. And then, other real life examples is Jay Sean. I don't know if you know this, but was in med school,
Oh
dropped
really?
out when his singing career,
Oh
pulled
wow.
through. So just
Yeah.
there are other options. If just because you're so deep in doesn't mean you can get out.
Right, right, exactly. And I've known a lot of people that have switched careers midway through. One of my well, the guys who was with me in medical school,
Hmm.
switched over to engineering. 2 years into medicine. It's a completely different field. Yeah, don't be afraid to do that, but you want to make sure you have kind of long term goals. You want to be working towards something. I
Hmm.
would say, you don't want to be jumping from one career to the next every couple years and end up, having to restart every
Yep.
couple years. You want to be working towards a goal,
Yeah.
and you can, and it's never too late to figure out what that is. There's people who switch careers, all the time, but make sure you're working towards something.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Elliot Corey.
Yeah,
Thank you for tuning
it's
in
great
on
to be here.
episode 4 on Simulated Podcast. You're always welcome back, good sir.
Absolutely.
Thank you. See you next time.
All right.
Peace.
Sounds good.
Cut.
Yeah.
Woo! That was good.
Yeah, man.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.